Hi everyone, welcome to week 4 of our SHSAT training program. This week's English topic is going to be purpose and perspective questions. And so basically what that means is you're going to be given some sort of section within a passage, and your job is going to be to figure out, the purpose that passage or that section of the passage serves in the development, in the progression even of the passage in general. So for example, you might be given like the context of an event that happens later, and then the purpose of that would be to, give you context to make sure you're not confused when you're reading about some later event in the passage. So as usual, we're going to start with some tips on how to answer questions like this. So first of all is you want to look back always at the part of the passage where the section you're looking at is from. And not only that, you sort of want to read a few sentences before and a few sentences after, because you want to know like sort of the context so that the section you're reading makes sense. You also want to know the immediate effect, because usually that's where you're going to actually find, if it's any sort of contextualization or something like that, that's where you're going to find the result of that or the impact of that in the passage. So second of all, you want to look for strong words that make you think in a certain way. So, these are all authors. They're good writers. They know how to influence an audience. So they're going to put words that subconsciously make you think about what you're reading in a specific way that they want you to think about it. So if you clue in on words like that sort of sway you, then that's probably the effect of the author, is to make you think in that way that you're being swayed. So the third piece of advice is slightly more abstract, but you want to imagine what would happen if that section wasn't in the passage. So for example, a thing that I used to do, that I like to do, is to read through the passage, maybe just the paragraph that section is in, and then the one before and the one after, and just skip the section that you're given. And just look at the effect that it has on you. If initially you were really sad about the end of a passage, and then after skipping the section you're like less sad about it because something in that section like made the ending sadder, then the purpose of that section is to make the reader feel sad, for example. If you're reading a later part of the passage and you have no idea what's going on because some sort of crucial information was given in the section that you skipped, then the purpose of the section is probably to just give the reader context or information about what's happening in the passage. And the last piece of advice is to think about your initial reaction as a reader to that section within the passage, because you're probably not going to be alone in having whatever reaction it might be. And so since the author wants to make most of his audience feel a certain way, that's probably the way you feel is probably the way he wants to make his readers in general feel. So in a sense, you're using yourself as a model reader for, who the author expects to be talking to, and, what the author wants the effect of a certain section of his passage to be like. So now we're going to look at some example questions from past SHSATs. So the first is from this passage about the first flight of Orville and Wilbur Wright. So it's important to note that this is actually written by Orville Wright. So although he's writing about their flight, he's also the author of it. So anytime a question mentions Orville Wright, that's essentially the same as like mentioning the author, because Orville Wright is the author. So I'm not going to read through everything here. If you want to pause the video here, you should do so to try and answer the question by yourself. I'm just going to get straight into it. Okay, so the question gives us, some section from, it says paragraph 5 of the passage, and we want to see the way it expresses Orville Wright's, or the author's, perspective about this first flight. And it essentially want to see like how this furthers the author's point of view, how this affects his point of view. So the passage essentially talks about the speed of the machine, which we know is the first plane, and the wind. And then he talks about the speed of the plane relative to the air, and then he talks about how far the flight would have gotten had there not been wind. So this is all here, but we also want to look at what's happening before this section in paragraph 5. So we can find it over here. This is where it starts. So a sudden dart, and so essentially before, not much is really given. We just know that this is right when the first flight begins. So this is him journaling about it. And then afterwards, he talks, this flight lasted only 12 seconds, but it was nevertheless the first in the history of the world in which a machine carrying a man had raised itself by its own power into the air in full flight, and yada, yada, yada. So we can see that he's rather optimistic after the end of this section. He says, it's only 12 seconds, it wasn't that long, but it was a step, and this was the first flight. So, we know that when he's writing this, he's actually feeling optimistic about their results. So now we want to look at the answer choices. So, answer choice E is actually not correct because no evidence is given that he's writing this while he's on the plane. We don't know who's flying the flight, and we don't know when this is written. This could have been written, in retrospect after. So it's not when he's attempting flight. So we know it's not E. So we know G. G looks promising because the section talks a lot about wind, and here it talks also about calm and high wind conditions. But this is also incorrect because there's no comparison being made because he's only talking about the flight in high wind. He never mentions anything about flights in calm wind conditions. So he's not comparing this flight with a previous flight. So it's not G either. And H is also incorrect because H mentions the importance of his calculations in the success of future flights. Well, we know that that's not correct because this passage, or any sort of section later in this passage, does not talk about future flights. It's only talking about this specific flight. So although we, in retrospect, almost over 100 years later, know that this data was very important, he did not talk about the importance of this data. And that leaves F. And so we know F is correct because, he emphasizes the fact that this flight would have gone a lot farther in better conditions. And he mentions that although it was a short flight, he mentions this after, it was actually, a success, and it was a good first step, which is sort of what F is saying. It's sort of keeping this optimistic idea that, although they didn't get that far this time, it's going to get them farther in the future. So the answer to this question is F. And now we're going to move on to Ode to Fireworks, which is, so similarly, I'm not going to read it. If you want to pause, you can do so here, but I'm just going to get straight into the answer. So this is slightly different because instead of just getting one block of text from somewhere within the passage, we're actually given 2 lines. We're given this phrase that's used, this rising and falling, and it's used both in lines 26 and 37. So we want to go to both of these lines and see what the context in which it was used was. So in line 26, the author is talking about where they used to live in the country, and it talks about the night, and then it talks about, crickets and singing, and their song is rising and falling. So in this context, what's rising and falling is the song of crickets, in the cornfields in the middle of the night in the country that they used to live in. And now we need to look at line 37 because that's where the phrase was mentioned again. So here it's they're at in a city on a 4th of July or New Year's festival. We're not really given the specific event that's happening, but we don't really care. We just know that it's some sort of big celebration. And the music around the author is the music of people, and their voices are what's rising and falling. So initially what was rising and falling was the song of crickets in the cornfield in the past, before the author moved to the city, and now it's currently the author is in the city, and we can see, in the past. So in the original, in line 26, the past tense was used, so we know it was happening before. and now it's the present tense. So we know that this is currently what's happening in the author's life. So we need to look at the we need to look at the answer choices. So E is actually incorrect because although it talks about the solitude in the cornfield and how there was no one around and it was pitch black, it never talks about meaningful interaction, because although it talks about being at this festival, no meaningful interaction with any specific people is mentioned. It just mentions, the bustle of people around the author, and they're all talking about their own things with other people. So it's not meaningful interaction in the author's eyes. G, although, maybe it shows that the author paid attention to the surrounding sounds, that's not really what the repeat of the words rising and falling does. The author could have just as easily not repeated, and we know that this is some sort of poetic device used by the author, and it's not merely to just say that the reader's paying attention to their surroundings. So it's not G. And H, fireworks are never mentioned. When rising and falling specifically refers to crickets and people at this festival that the author's at. It's not used to compare fireworks to anything, and it's not even related at all to fireworks. This rising and falling doesn't mention fireworks at all. And then we look at choice F, and we know that this is correct because it sort of compares the past, the world that the author used to live in, which was crickets and their sound rising and falling, and now the present, which is where the author is now, which is this festival where the people is what's rising and falling. And what threads these two things together is this phrase, rising and falling. This is why, this phrase is repeated, and this is why, this poetic device is used. It's used to compare the past of the author's life to the current and what's currently happening in the author's life. So the answer to this question is F. So yeah, that's pretty much it for questions like this. This is how you answer purpose and perspective questions on the SHSAT. As always, if you have questions, feel free to ask in the comments, and we'll see you next week.